Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett, and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. I call this episode, They Walk Among Us. UFOs, of course, are seen everywhere, all across our planet, and that's true for ETs as well. And in fact, ETs are sometimes seen in the most unexpected places. This includes schools, gas stations, churches, restaurants, on the bus, on a subway. I mean, you name it, casinos. People see ETs in public more often than you might think. And that's what this episode is about. I think these cases show some very interesting commonalities and have something to say about the whole phenomena itself. I've got about 15, 20 cases I'd like to share with you. Some are well known, some I think you probably haven't heard before. But I think you'll find it quite interesting. I certainly hope so. So let's just get started. And we'll start with Case 1, Aliens in a Bookstore. This is a fairly well-known case. It comes from Whitley Strieber and is written about in his book Communion. This involves actually the senior editor at Morrow Books, a gentleman by the name of Bruce Lee, who is the editor of Communion, and apparently in January of 1987 encountered ETs in a bookstore in New York City. This is at Wom Rath's bookstore. The book Communion had just been published, and Bruce and his wife were at the bookstore to see the display of Communion, and this is when they had a very unusual experience with what appeared to be ETs in a public space. And I will just let Bruce describe his experience in his own words. As he says, "I noticed a couple come into the store and head directly for Communion. I mean, it was just, you see them come in. They didn't know where the book was. You couldn't see it from the street. And they come in and headed back for where that rack was. Most unusual, if you see what I mean. They were short, and they were all wrapped up. Long scarves, wool hats that you pull down. And they pick up a copy of the book and they started thumbing through it. And it was obvious that they were speed reading it too. And they would say, 'Oh, he's got it wrong. He's got that wrong.' So because he was personally involved in publishing this book, Bruce approached the couple and asked them what was wrong. And as Bruce says, I think it was the woman that looked up. She was wearing those big sort of sunglasses that the girls keep in their hair, and they really sort of hide the face. But by God, behind those dark glasses, there was a goddamn big pair of eyes. And I mean to say it was a big pair of eyes. And they were shaped like almonds. You know how when you meet somebody the first time, you can frequently get an immediate reaction? The hackles on the back of my neck just went up. I got the feeling that I was in eyeball contact with somebody who did not like me at all. In fact, I got the impression that I was not wanted around there. I went over and I got my wife, and I got the hell out of there. I was almost shaking. I said, 'Did you see that couple?' And my wife said, 'Sure, I saw that couple.' And I said, 'Well, they don't look like goddamn people.' And she said, 'Well, you're crazy.' It was really a very intense shock. Bruce said that these figures were dressed up in so many clothes that there was really no skin visible. As he says, they were short, they were wearing boots, and it was sort of hard with those hats on to tell what was there underneath all the clothing. And of course you couldn't see the hands because they were in gloves. But what most impressed Bruce was the speed at which the people were reading. As he says, you do know when somebody's reading something and comprehending it, and these pages were turning very, very fast. So as strange as this sounds, Bruce and his wife believe that they may have witnessed what appear to be ETs in disguise in Wom Rath's bookstore in New York City. As Whitley Strieber says of this encounter, Mr. Lee feels that the event has brought him nothing but unwelcome exposure. This appearance was, I believe, as close to public and physical confirmation of their existence as the visitors have yet come. But as it turns out, there are many other cases. We now move to case 2, aliens at a convenience store. This case comes from Whitley Strieber's book, The Communion Letters. He received a lot of letters from people who read his book and wanted to share their story. And this story is one of the letters he received. We don't know the location, but it involves an anonymous woman who had a very strange experience. It was around December of 1984, and she and her 2 co-workers had just closed the office around 11 p.m. and were walking along the street to a small market. And as the woman says, just as I reached the corner, 3 globes of red light about the size and shape of eggs suddenly appeared in a circle around me. They floated around me rapidly at knee height. I am a large woman and sensitive to pranks, so I looked around to see if somebody was playing a joke on me. I thought maybe Tim or Harry, her co-workers, was using some sort of red flashlight to confuse and frighten me. I looked up and saw both of them standing across the street, and I called out to them, "What are you doing?" Both of them stared back at me in amazement. The woman was amazed, but she decided to just keep walking. And as she headed home, she stopped at a nearby deli, which she had been to many, many times. Only minutes earlier, she had seen these strange lights. So, as the woman says, all the counter guys at the deli know me. I go there all the time. But that night, there was a new guy I'd never seen before. He was very tall, at least 6 feet 3 or 4. His appearance was striking. He looked like he may have been a combination of African, Oriental, and Nordic blood. His skin was very pale, with a yellowish cast, and his hair was negroid with tight, kinky curls, except that it was the color of wheat. He had a broad mouth and very large, remarkable eyes, the color of gold coins, almond-shaped and slanted. He was dressed in the white uniform of a deli man. I put the milk on the counter and asked for my brand of cigarettes. I mentioned that he must be new there, because I knew everybody else. And he smiled gently and looked into my eyes and with a searching gaze. When he gave me my change, I noticed that his hands were very smooth and his fingers were very long. He seemed to be looking beyond me into the snowy white night when he said, "It doesn't happen very often, but when it does, it can be very scary." So that was a weird experience for her, and it was the next day at work that her coworkers, Tim and Harry, confronted this woman and demanded to know, what were those red lights around you last night? So clearly it wasn't a joke they were playing on her. And she went to the deli the next day and asked about this employee that she saw. And the workers at the deli denied that there was anybody new. And they also said that they were there last night and this woman had not shown up. So that is just beyond bizarre. I'm not sure what to make of it, but she is absolutely convinced that she saw an ET at the deli. So let's move on to the next case, which is case 3. Aliens at a gas station. This occurred to a lady by the name of Lisa Aarons in Fort Myers, Florida. And one evening in the mid-1990s, Lisa was driving through Fort Myers, driving home when she saw a metallic disc above her car. She had missing time of about 1 hour. And the next thing she knows, she's pulling up to a local gas station. And this is when things went really bizarre. As she says, when I walked back to my car, a man was standing there leaning on the trunk. This is embarrassing, but he was gorgeous, beautiful blue eyes. He spoke. I stopped and stared at him. He smiled. I stuttered and couldn't believe my eyes when I offered him a ride. I have never, ever done such a crazy thing before, but he was different. Somehow I couldn't stop myself. I took him to my house. So Lisa says she's not in the habit of picking up strange men, no matter how attractive they might be, but she just wasn't able to control her impulses. And before the next thing she knew, they were becoming intimate. And this is when something very strange happened. As Lisa says, and I quote, "Later that night, I felt him get up from the bed. The nightlight in my bedroom was on, and I could see him standing naked next to a full-length mirror. The next second is frozen in my mind. His reflection in the mirror was unreal. What I saw was the image of a small, dark creature with a big head and huge eyes. I sat up in bed. He moved into the bathroom and out of sight. When I finally looked in the bathroom, he was gone, and there is no window in the bathroom. I know this sounds crazy." So there you go, case 3. This ET apparently was disguised as in a very attractive man, but had the appearance of your typical gray. And there are other cases like this. We now move to case 4. Aliens at a park and on a bus and a restaurant. This is actually a series of events. It was first presented in Bud Hopkins' book, Intruders. The main witness is Debbie Jordan Cauble. She's actually written 2 books herself, one which came out quite recently. But back in July of 1975, Debbie and her friends were vacationing at Rough River State Park in Kentucky. And they were talking on the CB radio to some gentlemen. And this is when the very strange things began to happen. As Debbie says, they wanted to come and see us, and I told them if they could find us, they would be welcome. And it wasn't long after that that these gentlemen showed up, which should have been impossible because Debbie did not give them her location. As Debbie says, it sort of didn't make any sense. We could never figure out how they found us in the first place either, because when we were talking to them on the CB, we never told them how to get where we were. There weren't even any names for the roads around there, so I couldn't have explained it even if I wanted to. They just showed up, as I remembered, in a kind of clunky old car with hardly any lights on it. As this car drove up, Debbie noticed that it kind of glided over the bumpy road. It was a detail which later she realized was quite strange. And as she talked with these gentlemen and associated with them, many other strange details emerged. As Debbie says, they were all 4 young men, very handsome. They all looked very much alike, like brothers or twins even. They were all wearing blue shirts, and as she says, they were, quote, real cute. He had a round face and blue eyes, real light brown, light blonde hair, curly down to his collar. The other 2 guys just sort of stood there. One stood by the door. I don't think they said anything at all. Debbie said that the main guy, who did all the talking, smiled with his eyes. And as Bud Hopkins says, it was a phrase I'd heard before in other UFO cases. At one point, Debbie entered the cabin where the 4 men were staying, and she got a real shock. As she says, I was sure some of them would have been in bed since it was late, but they were all up, just sitting there and standing, and the TV wasn't even on. They were just still, not moving, like they were hardly awake and not saying anything. And my head started to feel funny between my eyes. And then the blonde guy spoke, and everyone kind of came to life and began to move and talk. It was really weird, like they had been asleep or something. So it was a weird enough experience that Debbie thought it was related to her many, many UFO encounters. And 8 years later, in 1983, there would be an astonishing sequel to this event when she encountered what she believes is a human-looking ET on a bus. She had just gone to see Bud Hopkins in New York and was on a bus going back to her home. She was somewhere in Pennsylvania when a strange gentleman got on the bus and actually sat right next to her. And as Debbie says, suddenly I felt very strange. This prickly sensation washed over me, and I got the distinct feeling someone was boarding the bus that I needed to see. I peeked up over the back of the seat in front of me, and what I saw nearly took my breath away. There stood the most beautiful man I have ever seen, and he was looking directly at me as he walked up the steps to the bus. It was as if he knew I was there before he even got on the bus. He was about 6'4", medium build, yet slim. He had shoulder-length wavy, medium blonde hair, and the most perfectly structured face I have ever seen. So this began what was definitely the strangest bus ride Debbie has ever taken in her life. This man sat down next to her and began to talk to her, and she noticed many strange details about this man. This was a very long bus ride. As she says, I noticed that his voice was very soft and smooth, and he seemed to be speaking with some kind of sing-song accent. It was very slight, so slight in fact that I first thought he was faking it for my benefit. I asked him where he was from. He said he was from near Sweden. That didn't make much sense. It didn't sound like a Swedish accent to me. But I noticed after a while that he never seemed to show any signs of beard growth, despite the fact that we were together on the bus for more than 17 hours. I also noticed that every time he touched me, however lightly, on the arm or the face, his touch was exceptionally warm, and I could feel the warmth flow through my whole body, relaxing and calming me. I didn't realize at the time how unusual any of this was. So things were about to get much stranger. After the bus ride, the two of them went together to a fast food restaurant and sat down. And this is when the gentleman started to behave in a very unusual way and ask unusual questions. As Debbie says, when we started to order, he turned to me and asked me what the difference was between bacon and sausage. Then he asked me what he should eat. I told him what the difference was between those two foods and told him that they were both good by me. He proceeded to order just about one of everything on the menu, and when he saw how small the orange juice containers were, he complained loudly and then ordered 4 of them. The girls waiting on us looked at him as if he was some kind of green-haired alien. I was kind of embarrassed by how he was acting. And Debbie was absolutely baffled by this gentleman and baffled by her own reaction to him. And she felt like she couldn't live without him, and she was terrified she might never see him again. And at that exact moment, he turned to her as if reading her mind and said, "Don't worry, we'll see each other again." So after going to this restaurant, they were walking back to the bus station. And as Debbie says, we passed a group of people sitting on the benches. They absolutely stared a hole through us as we walked by. I'd bet we were a sight, him so tall and me so short. But the look we got from them was even stranger than just them noticing our different heights. They actually looked totally dumbstruck. I was talking to him when I noticed them. It was almost as if I was talking to myself, and they thought I was some kind of nut. So more strange things happened. Debbie walked to the restroom, and this gentleman started to follow her in, apparently not realizing that men were not allowed in the women's bathroom. And She told him he was nauseous. He did not understand the concept of nausea or vomiting, and was totally fascinated when Debbie presented him with a Pepto-Bismol pill. And he was absolutely delighted and entranced by the colorful newspapers, and he insisted that Debbie get him one. So these were all very strange details that Debbie really wondered about, 'cause it reminded her of the earlier experience she had, and she wondered if this guy could have been an ET. And she told this to Bud Hopkins, and together they were able to trace this man back to Cincinnati, Ohio, and learned that this gentleman would disappear for long periods of time, sometimes years, and no one knew where he was, and then he would just show up again. So it's a strange story. Is this an ET? Hard to say for sure, but Debbie definitely thought that this was a distinct possibility. And there are other cases. We now move to case 5, aliens at a school and a convenience store. This case comes from Hans Holzer, perhaps best known for his ghost research, but he also wrote a book about UFOs and ETs called The UFOnauts. And this book features the story of Shane Kurz, a high school student from upstate New York. And she had a missing time encounter. She saw ETs with grayish looking skin, but were otherwise human looking. And after having this encounter, she later recalled an earlier incident in which she saw what may have been an ET in front of the Westmoreland High School in New York. This was before her first abduction in 1968. And as Shane says, and I quote, "One day I decided to go to school early, and when I was about 50 yards from the school entrance, somebody came up behind me. It was raining, and I was carrying an umbrella, and I had not seen anyone on the street prior to that, but suddenly somebody appeared behind me and said, 'Hello, Shane, may I share your umbrella?' I turned around, and I saw a man walk up to me. He struck me as being different by the fact that his appearance just didn't seem to fit in with the way everyone looked around my area. His dress was a little more modern, maybe a year or two ahead of ours, so I thought he was a stranger. He had on corduroy pants and a plaid shirt, but his eyes and ears were the strangest things. I was fascinated by his ears because they seemed to come to a point and were very sharp compared to ours. Also, his eyes were gray, and yet when I looked at them, they seemed to go as if I could see completely through them. They were very magnetic. He seemed to talk with some kind of accent, but I couldn't quite place it. It sounded a little on the Oriental side. His eyes were slightly slanted, not up but sort of back. His hair was light brown. He did not wear a hat, which was unusual because it was cold and raining. And he wore no coat either. He wore no necktie. His shirt was open. He was about 5'4" and came level with my shoulder. And when he walked, he never took his hands out of his pockets." So she was concerned about how this gentleman knew her name, and she asked him about it, and he evaded the question and began asking some very bizarre questions. He asked Shane what she did during her lunch hour at school. And she told him that she played volleyball or basketball. And he asked, "What is volleyball? What is basketball?" And Shane said that everybody knows about these games, but this stranger insisted that she explain these games to him. And then he asked her, "During your lunch hour, would you like to go for a ride?" And when she said that she didn't see any car, he pointed to a nearby field and said, "Oh, my vehicle is over there. It is a white vehicle." Shane politely declined, and then came the strangest part of this encounter. As Shane says, I sort of ended the conversation by saying, "It was nice meeting you." And I turned around, and I think I took 3 steps. He didn't follow me. I turned out of curiosity to see where he went, and he wasn't there. No more than 3 seconds had passed from the time I took the steps and turned around, and there was no possible way he could have gotten out of my sight that quickly. I was stunned. So Shane quickly scanned the whole area, but there was no sign of this gentleman. And some of the girls in the area walked up to her afterwards, and she asked them, "Did you see that stranger that I was just talking to?" And they said, "Yes. Who was that cute boy you were walking with?" So this turned out to have a sequel a short time later. 1 month later, Shane was at the local convenience store and had a very strange encounter. And again, I'll just let Shane describe what happened in her own words. As she says, "I was in the store looking at a magazine when a man with very thin blonde hair, hardly any hair on his head, and extremely white skin kept looking at me. He wore a black overcoat which covered him completely. It seemed almost too long and too big for him. I thought perhaps he was an albino because his eyes were so clear looking. He kept smiling at me, and I became somewhat nervous because of his staring and hanging around. He wasn't buying anything, and as I was walking around the store getting things, he seemed to hang in back. And when I stopped at the magazine counter and was looking through them, he just kept looking at me in a sort of shy way. He never said a word or anything, but I felt his presence behind me all along. I tried to ignore him. Then I turned around and he was gone." So she quickly looked around to see if she could find where this strange man had went, but he was nowhere to be seen. And it was less than a year later that she was abducted inside a UFO, inside a craft, and inside was this same figure that she had seen at the convenience store. So she believes she encountered an ET in a public place. It's very interesting details in these cases that seem to turn up again and again. And here's another case. This is case 6, an alien at a gas station. So this is our second encounter at a gas station, and this comes from UFO contactee John Hunter Gray. On March 20th, 1988, John Hunter Gray and his son had a missing time encounter outside of Richland Center, Wisconsin. But it was before this encounter that something very strange happened. They were at a gas station in La Crosse, Wisconsin, when they saw a very strange-looking gentleman next to them at the gas station. I'll just let John Hunter Gray describe what happened in his own words. As he says, and I quote, "An odd thing occurred at a mobile station at La Crosse. Just as we were climbing into the pickup after gassing up, a strange-looking little man, bundled in a coat and a Greek fisherman's cap, rushed in a stumbling fashion from the station to his Volvo. John was really impressed because not only was the man strange-looking, and the way he walked was strange, and he was very little and short, he was also wrapped up in all these clothes that covered pretty much his entire body, even though it was warm daylight outside. The hat was overly large, it had a huge rim, it covered most of his face, and the man also wore sunglasses. So really you could see very little skin at all. But at one point, John looked this figure in the eyes, and he could feel, as he says, the piercing gaze of this strange little man. So as this man kind of stumbled in a weird kind of gait into his car, they drove off, and the man started to follow them in his car. As John Hunter Gray says, "We left the station on a little intra-La Crosse freeway. He followed us. I slowed down substantially, but he declined to pass. He remained behind us until we took the 1416 turnoff. In the aftermath of the encounter, our minds were drawn repeatedly to this seemingly insignificant episode, because it was right after this gentleman turned off from the highway that John Hunter Gray and his son encountered a UFO, had missing time, and were taken on board. John Hunter Gray, by the way, experienced more than 20 physiological improvements, healings, as a result of his UFO encounter, which he recalled naturally without the aid of hypnosis. And now they're wondering if this encounter at the gas station was connected to this missing time encounter they had, and that perhaps this figure at the gas station was an actual ET. Could be, because this is sort of the pattern we see in these types of cases. And here's another case. We now move to case 7, aliens at a hotel. This case comes from violinist and UFO researcher author Timothy Good, who has written a series of books about UFOs, often involving human-looking ETs. Timothy Good became interested in UFOs in 1961, began reading and researching about them, and learned that telepathy plays a strong role in UFO encounters. So, knowing that there are human-looking ETs and that they communicate telepathically, he wondered if they were walking among us and it might be possible for him to contact them. So he decided to do an experiment. He was in New York at the Park Sheraton Hotel, and he sat down in the lobby for about an hour and started sending out the mental message, "If there are any space people around, let your presence be known." And to his surprise, this experiment appeared to work. As Timothy Good says, and I quote, "Finally, as I was about to give up, a very healthy-looking man, about 5'10", came over and sat down beside me and took out a copy of the New York Times from his attaché case. Stunned, Timothy Good mentally requested, 'If you're a spaceman, touch your finger to your nose.' The response was immediate and positive. As Timothy Good says, without once looking directly at me, he did exactly as I had requested in my silent message." Timothy Good was so amazed that he was unable to react as the man quickly stood up and walked away. But to this day, he is convinced that he made contact with a human-looking ET right there at the Park Sheraton Hotel in Manhattan, New York City. So there you go. I mean, case after case like this. And now we move on to another case, which is case 8, an alien on the 7th Avenue subway. This is another case in New York City. For whatever reason, New York seems to have a lot of these cases. And this case involves an anonymous witness. In the summer of 1969, she was riding the 7th Avenue subway when she saw a gray alien. As she says, "In the middle of the 7th Avenue subway rush hour crowd, I saw a little man about 4 feet tall. He had a huge head, but it was the quality of his skin that first caught my attention. It didn't look like human skin, but more like plastic or rubber. I knew he wasn't human. I tried to follow him with my eyes, but he quickly got lost in the crowd. No one else seemed to notice. This disturbed me. I thought I was seeing things." So many cases of ETs in public places, or what appear to be ETs. Another New York City case follows. This is case 9. Alien at a cafe. This involves a lady from the Bronx in New York, and she's had experiences her whole life. In 1975, she was abducted from her home in the Bronx and has had many encounters. And one really unusual encounter occurred in 1995 at an outdoor cafe near Battery Park City in New York. She was sitting at this outdoor cafe when suddenly she saw the short, hazy silhouette of a gray alien approaching her table. And as soon as it reached the table, this gray became fully visible and told Brenda to come with him. And Brenda suddenly found herself holding on to this being as they flew up over the Hudson River and into a dark-colored UFO hovering very high up in the sky. Once inside, Brenda was subjected to a typical sort of physical examination and then was returned to this sidewalk cafe in Battery Park City, New York. So yeah, ETs can appear in the most unlikely places. And if you don't believe that case, there's always another one to fill its place. We now move to case number 10, an alien at Penn Station. It was October 1st, 1999 in the afternoon when an anonymous witness saw a very tall, non-human looking entity in the middle of a crowd at Penn Station, a very crowded train station. As this anonymous witness writes, "I was ascending the escalator at Penn Station when I reached the street level. About 20 feet away, I saw what seemed like a male figure standing about 6 feet 7 inches near the mouth of the entrance to the station. Crowds of commuters flowed around him as though he wasn't there. He stared at the variety of passerbys as though he was trying to choose one of them. I caught a glimpse of his face, maybe his eyes too. I don't remember if he looked at me or not." The witness says that she stared at this figure for only a few seconds and then kept walking because she became afraid. As she says, "The fear instilled in me was so tremendous that to this day I can't explain it. His face was not human. His eyes looked right through you. It was something I wanted to forget as soon as possible, but I couldn't. It was as though he had some kind of will that said, 'Keep walking, don't stop, don't look, this does not concern you.' His face was a light gray, almost white, thick brown menacing eyes, and the thing that stays in my mind the most was his stature, or the way he was standing. His back arched, broad shoulders, his elbows pointed towards his back, his head tilted down just a bit, looking at the tops of people's heads, scoping them out." So, there you go, an alien at Penn Station. And there are many cases. Here's another case that I covered in my presentation, the top 20 cases in Nevada, also covered in my book, UFOs over Nevada, but I thought I'd tell it here because it's such an extraordinary case. This is case 11, aliens at a casino, and it comes from Nevada-based researcher Misha Johnston. She's also an experiencer. She's written a book about her experiences, and she interviewed a gentleman who was a security guard at a casino. And he was in one of the monitoring rooms where there were many screens which looked over the gambling tables. And he was in this room when everyone's attention was drawn to one table where there were around 6 or 7 people gambling, including what appeared to be 2 short figures with largish bald heads, and they were wearing what looked like white tunics or robes. And it was very interesting because no one around them seemed to notice these figures or notice how strange they were looking. And what was even more strange was during this event, one of these figures actually looked up and straight into the camera. This was a hidden camera. People did not know where it is. You shouldn't be able to see it from the table. and yet this figure seemed to know exactly where this camera was and looked right into the camera. So this casino security guard was able to sneak out some of the footage, and as you can see from this picture, it does appear to show very strange looking figures at this casino table. And there, as it turns out, are a number of cases involving ETs at casinos. Another case was reported by an anonymous gentleman who saw what he believes are ETs at the Tropicana casino. As this gentleman says, "I went to the restroom around 4 a.m. and on my way back to the tables, I stopped and watched a peculiar individual walking up the stairs. This person had a hat and sunglasses on, yet something wasn't right with the way he was walking or climbing the stairs. It looked like he was stuck in the mud. His knees sort of came out to the side as he tried raising his feet to take the next step. I also noticed that there were about 3 more that looked just like him at the top of the stairs, yet some were taller. They were all skinny, tall, and I recall noticing their whitish-like hair that seemed to shimmer as if the light was bouncing off of it. I have never seen hair like this before. My reaction was, what a freak." And it was at this exact moment that the figure that was walking up the stairs stopped, turned around, and stared at the witness as if reading his thoughts. The witness quickly returned to his table, and it wasn't until 15 years later or so that he heard about Charles Hall, a weather observer from Nevada, who wrote a series of books called Millennial Hospitality. Charles Hall is a contactee who claims that he met tall whites and that these were largely human-looking ETs who would sometimes travel to Las Vegas casinos in disguise, wearing wigs and makeup and such, and that they would mingle among the local population. So yeah, aliens at casinos. These are just a few of the cases involving aliens at casinos, but I definitely thought it was worth mentioning because it shows this same pattern of aliens in public places. And now we move to the next case, which is case 12, aliens in a convenience store. This is one of my favorite cases of this kind. It's quite strange. It comes from UFO researcher and author John Colombo in his book, UFOs over Canada. This case occurred on May 24, 1958 in Toronto, Canada, and the main witness is a gentleman by the name of David Harris. He's a musician, a drummer, and a security guard, and he was just a teenager at the time of this incident. He was in his home with his family when they saw a UFO land in an area they call the Witch's Orchard. This is a grove of maple trees, which is now perhaps better known as Maple Leaf Forever Park. So David and his family watched this UFO land, and after it landed, these 2 figures walked out of the orchard. They were strange-looking figures, and David's mom turned to David and says, "Those people are from that thing. We are going to follow them and find out where they're going." So David, his mom, and his brother followed these 2 people into the local town there, and they walked into the little convenience store not far from their home. And David's mom instructed him to walk into the convenience store and buy some popsicles and see what these 2 figures were up to. And as David says, "I could see the back of the man. He had on a pair of long black boots. He wore a black belt. He had a tanned complexion and sandy blonde hair." David said it was strange because as he stood next to these people, he felt this unbelievably powerful feeling of goodness coming from them. As he says, I felt good inside. I felt good as I was standing beside him. So we carefully observed this strange man and woman, and as David says, what stood out in my mind was the gray color of the uniforms the lady and the man were wearing. The lady's long black boots, her thin body structure, her black hair. And as is typical in these kinds of cases, these figures started asking very strange questions. As David says, next the lady looked at me and started asking questions about where they were. She said they were time travelers or something like that. I felt full of love and power. She then turned to the store owner and asked him about the cigarettes on the shelf behind him. She kept on asking questions about everything, so I knew that they were not from here. Their dress was really different. Her suit was sort of transparent, but not tight-fitting. She wore earrings. Like the man, she had on a black belt. I remember that his belt had keys on it, a number of silver-like skeleton keys fastened to the left side of his belt. This lady then walked right up to David and asked his name and spoke to him about religion and other subjects, telling him that he would understand at a later age. And as David said, she knew that I saw the two of them come off the ship. She asked me if I would like to go with the two of them into the ship. I said yes, but then her companion interrupted her. She turned to him and he began to talk to her in a different language. It sounded weird, but I felt that I would be willing to go anywhere with them. I felt great trust coming from both of them, love, the greater knowledge of freedom that they had. After a few more bizarre questions, this strange couple left, and David, his mother, and little brother followed this couple down the street. And the next thing they know, they are waking up in the living room of their house. So they had missing time. And as David says, both my mom and I had been put to sleep and were back waking up at the same time. My mom was sitting at the end of the couch beside a window. Steve was sitting on the floor, and I was out of it. I felt high. I looked at my mom. Her hair was messed up, and she was nodding. We were going in and out of consciousness. The first thing she did was look out the window to her right. Then she looked around the apartment and said, "Oh, look, the popsicles have melted." So yeah, a very strange case in which ETs apparently came into the local convenience store and then back into their craft. And this was a missing time encounter. So I think it's a definite possibility that David and his mom and brother were also taken on board the craft, although they have no memory of this. So these are the kinds of cases we're hearing of aliens in public places. And here's another case. This is case 13, aliens at a church. This case comes from prominent UFO researcher Richard Dolan and appears in his book, UFOs for the 20th Century Mind. And this case involves a young woman who saw a very strange-looking couple in a church in Pennsylvania. She went to the church with her family, and her attention was drawn to a strange yet attractive-looking blonde-haired couple sitting up towards the front of the church. And they were wearing matching blue suits that, according to the witness, were like perfectly put together. And this couple seemed really unfamiliar with all the church rituals that were going on. And this is when things became very strange. This witness started to telepathically hear this couple conversing between each other. She could hear what they were saying telepathically to each other. And at one point, the female turned to her male companion and said, telepathically, "She can hear us." So it was apparent to the witness that this strange couple knew that they were being observed by her. And following the church services, this couple quickly departed the church service, and the witness ran after them into a little park area, a wooded area beyond the church. And as she was following them, a mysterious figure emerged from the woods and confronted her, and she became quite frightened because he was very tall, wearing a hat. He was all dressed in black and had a very strange appearance, and in fact reminded her of Lurch from the Addams Family. And this was enough to stop her from following any further, and that's where this case ends. So yeah, apparently another case of ETs in a public place. And here's another case, case 14, aliens at a coffee bar. This is a very strange case with a lot of strange elements. It took place in Dunedin, New Zealand, at a popular coffee bar, a coffee shop. This was on July 12th, 1975, when 4 friends, Richard, Pat, Nancy, and Ross, all decided to go to this restaurant. At the time, they were suffering from a slight case of the flu, and they had sat down at a table and were beginning to drink and eat when suddenly time appeared to stop. Suddenly, all sound stopped and nobody was moving at all. So this was very strange. One of the witnesses, Richard, was really struck by the sight of the steam standing perfectly still coming from the coffee machines, and a waitress bending over the stove pulling out hotcakes. She was completely frozen in place, as was everybody, except for these 4 people were able to move. And this is when suddenly a figure appeared at the top of the stairs on the opposite side of the room, which is the only public entrance into this establishment. And this figure was a man, a young man about 6 feet tall, slender, with black wavy hair and olive green skin. He was well dressed in normal clothes, but seemed to have a whitish aura of light glowing around him. And as they watched, this man floated, levitated down the stairs, across the room, and to the line where people were waiting to order their food. And the moment he got into line, suddenly everything became normal again. Time resumed, the sounds came back, and this gentleman just waited in line. So they stared at him as he ordered a glass of juice and sat down at a nearby table. He turned to them and acknowledged them with a smile, and they decided that they were going to confront this man. But instead of going up to his table directly, they left the restaurant and waited at the entrance. Unfortunately, the man never came out, so they went back inside and he was nowhere to be found. Very strange. Even stranger was that all 4 of them who had been suffering from the flu noticed that their flu symptoms had completely disappeared. So I'm not sure what's going on here, but there is an interesting sequel to this event. It was just 6 weeks later when this same group of people, these 4 friends, were at the same restaurant when this man showed up again. And they were all sitting in the restaurant when this man appeared at the stairs and walked down the stairs normally this time. He again seemed to have an aura of light around him. No one else seemed to notice him. And he sat down at a nearby table, again ordered a glass of juice, and smiled back at them. And this time they decided that they were going to walk directly to his table and confront him and ask him who he was. And the instant they decided to do that, they said that they couldn't. They suddenly became compelled to leave the restaurant. They couldn't help themselves. They all quickly got up and walked out. They did not want to. They were trying not to, but they felt as if they were compelled to do so. One of them, Pat, says that she tried desperately to turn around but was unable to do so, and when she finally did, she quickly returned back to the restaurant, but the strange man was gone. So apparently he was able to exert his willpower over these people. I don't know, it's a bizarre case. I don't know what to make of some of these cases, except that there are so many of them. I think they deserve serious consideration. And here's another one. And this is, again, is a very bizarre case. This is case 15. An alien on the beach and in a theater. This case comes from Dr. David Jacobs, Ph.D., a very prominent researcher who wrote the book The Threat, or They Walk Among Us, and other books on UFOs. And he interviewed a abductee by the name of Donna. I believe that's a pseudonym. And Donna says that she had often seen an alien hybrid in public places in full public view. As David Jacobs writes, and I quote, Donna's experiences began when she was a young child, and by the time she was 20, she was meeting with her hybrid in public. One such encounter took place in the summer of 1969 while Donna and some of her friends were on a jetty enjoying the ocean in Maine. Donna became separated from her friends, and that was when this hybrid suddenly showed up. He was wearing blue jeans, a jacket, and a t-shirt. He had shoulder-length hair, and this hybrid and Donna hid underneath the jetty there, and he told her that he had seen her in a summer stock play the previous evening. And according to Donna, this figure, this hybrid, told her that he had actually been in the audience watching her perform. And Donna had a familiar reaction to his presence, as she says, "He's there, and that's all I care about. I can't get enough of him. It's like every pore in my body wants to open up and take him." And eventually, Donna was actually seduced by this hybrid, and they ended up becoming intimate. This, again, is a pattern we've seen in other cases. And afterwards, this mysterious figure disappeared as mysteriously as he arrived. And years later, she would be visited by him again. So she has seen this same gentleman several times, and often when he appears, he seduces her, and they end up becoming intimate. It's definitely a pattern we see in some of these cases. And I know of another case of a lady I was able to talk to personally. This I call Case 16, an alien at a UFO convention. Unfortunately, I was not able to do a formal interview with this woman, so I really can't say for sure about this case. But this lady was a tall, dark-haired, attractive woman who said that she was at a UFO convention and decided to take a break and was sitting in the corridor in the hallway when suddenly there was a powerful flash of light right in front of her, and out stepped a gentleman. This sort of weird mist or smoke dissipated, and here was this attractive-looking, smartly dressed gentleman who walked up to her and told her that he was an ET who mingled among the local population and occasionally visited for a while and then would leave off to wherever he was coming from. Not quite sure what to make of it, but the lady who I spoke with, the witness, wanted to share this story, and she asked me, are there any other cases like this? Have you ever heard of anything like this? And I had to tell her that yes, these sort of cases do turn up. Unfortunately, again, I was not able to do a formal interview with her, but it just goes to show that there are ETs showing up in public places. And there are plenty more cases, and I would repeat them, but they start to get repetitive. I'll just mention a few real briefly. And one case comes from contactee Howard Menger, who wrote a book From Outer Space to You about his contacts with human-looking ETs. He says he met a human-looking ET while recovering in an army tent hospital in Okinawa during the World War. And he says later, while in New Jersey, he was having contacts with human-looking ETs who would sometimes travel into town to buy fruits and vegetables and other items, and were absolutely human-looking and could mingle among the local population. Another similar case comes from controversial contactee George Adamski, who says that he met human-looking ETs in a hotel lobby and later at a public restaurant. His case is controversial, though there are some researchers who feel that his case, at least in part, is genuine. Then, of course, there's Billy Meyer, whose case is also controversial. Billy Meyer is a farmer from Switzerland who's had repeated contacts and with a female ET by the name of Semyazi. And according to Billy Meyer, Semyazi often would mingle among the local population. Another case involving a contactee is that of Frank Stranges, a California-based contactee who is probably most famous for telling the story of Valiant Thor, a human-looking ET. Again, a very controversial case. The reason I bring these up is because there are so many of them. Another case comes from Ludwig Pullman, who wrote a book about his encounters with Wendell C. Stevens. According to Ludwig, he met a human-looking ET by the name of Satu Ra while traveling by train through India. And also later had a visit with this human-looking ET while recovering from kidney stones in Peru. And he says he was actually healed by a human-looking ET while in this hospital. So make of it what you will. There are a lot of these cases. Just one final one comes from Ingo Swann, the famous psychic, who wrote a book about some of his experiences as a psychic spy and also about UFOs and his contacts. This book is called Penetration. And according to Ingo Swann, he met what he believes was a female ET in a grocery store in Los Angeles, California. He described her as being extraordinarily beautiful, which is a description we hear from a lot of these witnesses. So there you go. That's 15, 20 cases of human-looking ETs in public places. Are not always human-looking, sometimes grays or strange humanoids. So make of it what you will, but these cases do have a lot of commonalities. David Jacobs believes that these types of encounters will probably increase in number as time goes on, because he believes ETs have a plan to sort of mingle among the human population. As David Jacobs says, and I quote, "Independent hybrid activity is a logical outcome of the abduction phenomena and the breeding program, and it has profound implications for the future of human-alien interaction. It involves hybrids who can, for short periods of time, pass unnoticed in human society, acting independently and free from the presence and control of the Greys. Late-stage hybrids strive to pass for human, but within limits. In public, they dress like humans, blend into the general population, and go unnoticed. They usually wear average casual clothes. The males wear jeans or khakis, t-shirts or long-sleeve shirts. Late-stage hybrids may dress in military-like clothes, such as one-piece jumpsuits that resemble flight suits. Because they look so human, it is easy to mistake them for American military personnel, and many abductees have linked military personnel to their abductions. But definitely, they are among us. I wrote about some of these cases and others in my book, Not From Here, Volume 1. And I think there are enough of these cases to say that they do occur. And there's very interesting commonalities to these cases. In case after case, these ETs are described as having a very strange appearance. They look exotic. Often the witnesses will mention their hypnotic eyes, the hypnotic quality of their eyes. So I think that's a definite clue. Also, they're often described as dressed strangely. Either they're in weird clothes or perhaps are bundled up completely wearing hats, sunglasses, and gloves so that no skin shows at all. They are described as walking strangely, shuffling, or as the gentleman in the casino case said, walking as if in mud. So that's strange. So not only do they look strange, dress strange, they move strangely. And beyond that, their behavior is strange. They ask all these bizarre questions about society and about common things that every person here on Earth knows. Another weird aspect to these cases is that some of them end up with people having intimate relations with the ETs. I know of a few other cases I didn't mention in which that happened. So that is definitely a pattern as well. And a final pattern that turns up in a number of these cases is that the people will be talking to these figures and suddenly they will disappear. They'll turn around for a second and boom, this figure is gone. So all these strange details begin to add up, and the fact that they appear over and over again in separate cases, I think really lends a level of corroboration and credibility to them. I don't know. I'm really not sure what to make of some of these cases, but I wanted to present them because there are so many, and I think they have these very interesting commonalities. And I think they have something to say about this phenomena, which is that not only can UFOs appear anywhere, but ETs themselves can appear anywhere. Apparently Greys do have the ability to disguise themselves as humans, and ETs can be seen in the most unlikely places. So next time you're out in public, I think it might be a good idea to watch out for people who are walking strangely, who look a little different or off, who are dressed strangely and show all these different attributes that might mark them as ETs walking among us. So that's the show for today. I hope you've enjoyed this strange and bizarre episode. I want to thank you very much for watching. I really appreciate it. And until next time, keep searching for the truth and keep having fun.